All right, last week we started a brand new series, and the series is called Life Hacks, the Power of Habits. And the idea is that at the very beginning of the year, oftentimes we make New Year's resolutions, or we decide that we want to be, we want this next year to be a little bit better than the year before. But oftentimes we fail those New Year's resolutions, or we start a new good habit only to see it trail off rather quickly. So we thought it might be good to start this year off by asking the question, like, what is God calling you to look like? Who is he calling you to be? And how is it that you can actually become that person? Now, every week also, we have folks who are with us who are followers of Jesus. They're here because they've decided to call him their Lord. But we also have people who are here who are just checking faith out or just trying to see if Jesus might be for them. And so regardless of where you fall now, we're really excited that you're here today. And maybe you're not sure if God's calling you to be anything or if you even think God exists at all. But even you probably, if have an idea in your mind of what a better version of you could look like. So how is it that we get from where we are to this place where we'd like to be or where we feel that God is calling us? And so last week I shared some resources that kind of serve as a foundation for this series. And if you are interested in buying things and reading them and learning more, these are kind of some of the things that I've used. The Compound Effect is a book by Darren Hardy, really excellent. This is the one I said last week that I'll be giving to my kids to read when they're probably 14, 15 years old, because it's a short, fast read, and I think it's very motivating. And so I want to help them out with that. There's another book called Atomic Habits. I referenced this a little last week, but I'll be leaning on it heavily today. Today I'm going to talk more about some content from this particular book. There's another book that a few of you talked to me about in the lobby last week, actually, by Duhigg, called The Power of Habit. Now, this is one that I've read a while ago. James Clear, actually, in the Atomic Habits, builds off a lot of Duhigg's work. So if this is a book you found helpful, some of what we talk about today may be a little bit familiar. And then finally, there's a sermon series by a pastor who I have a lot of admiration for, named Craig Rochelle of Life Church, last year, called Habits. But essentially where we started last week is just with this idea from James Clear that your outcomes are a lagging measure of your habits. Your net worth is a lagging measure of your financial habits. Your weight is a lagging measure of your eating habits. Your knowledge is a lagging measure of your learning habits. Your clutter is a lagging measure of your cleaning habits. You get what you repeat. And one that I added last week was to say that your spiritual condition is a lagging measure of your spiritual habits. So if you feel like you are supposed to be in a different place than you are today, whether it's if you're in your walk with Jesus or in the relationships in your life or even in a vocational goal that you're pursuing, there are habits that you can build into your life to get you closer to where you feel God is calling you. There are also habits that you are doing right now probably that are hindering you from becoming that person who God is calling you to be. So today, we're just going to kind of like quick review a little bit more from last week. We're going to talk then about why it is so hard sometimes to install new habits in our life. We're going to look at a habit, what we call a habit loop, how habits are actually formed. Today, and you're welcome for this, we're still not going to make you like choose any new habits or to drop any bad ones. We're just thinking about this. We're talking about this. And hopefully today is helpful, whereas next week we'll come back and do a little bit more work with it. So one of the things we said last week too is successful people do consistently what other people do occasionally, right? That it's easy to occasionally do good things, but to really consistently make it a habit is a whole other ballgame. No one accidentally stumbles into positive transformation. So where I want to start today, we looked last week at Jesus and some habits he had built in, like rest and prayer. This week I want us to look at the Apostle Paul. He's one of the very first Christians, planted a ton of churches around the Mediterranean Rim, and wrote a good chunk of the New Testament. And I want to look at what he says about kind of the changes and the transformation that we need in our life and why it's so difficult. So if this feels familiar to you, just recognize that how you have felt in the past is not new. That people have been feeling like this for thousands of years. This is what he writes in the book of Romans in chapter 7. I don't really understand myself. I want to do what is right, but I don't do it. Instead, I do what I hate. I want to do what is right, but I can't. I want to do what is good, but I don't. You ever had that feeling? Like you want to start something new, you really do intellectually, but you just can't quite get it started. Or you want to stop doing that thing, but it's become a habit. You just keep coming back to it, and it's really hard to stop it. Paul goes on to say, I don't want to do what is wrong, but I do it anyway. Oh, what a miserable person I am. Who will free me from this life that is dominated by sin and death? And this is the thing. When you have something in your life that you want to stop or that you want to start, and you find yourself unable to do those things, you feel miserable. You feel like an undisciplined failure is what you feel like. And so it just oftentimes adds to some of the guilt you're walking around with or the shame that you feel. And then you just keep going back to those habits over and over again to try to make yourself feel better from the guilt and shame you just piled on yourself. It's just this endless cycle that can be really, really difficult. So what's the solution? Who can save me from it? Paul's going to point us to Jesus. Thank God the answer is in Jesus Christ, our Lord. In fact, Paul believed that Christ wanted us to be transformed from the inside out. And Jesus calls us to do that. He also believed that Jesus would give us the means by which to do it, that Christ is inside of you. The Holy Spirit's inside of you, living inside of you. He goes on in Ephesians chapter 4, and he says this. He's talking about what you once were and how you once behaved before choosing to put your faith in Jesus. And then he writes, but that isn't what you learned about Christ. Since you have heard about Jesus and have learned the truth that comes from him, throw off your old sinful nature and your former way of life, which is corrupted by lust and deception. Instead, let the Spirit renew your thoughts and attitudes. Put on your new nature, created to be like God, truly righteous and holy. So Paul says, look, there was a way that you once were, but you are not to be that way anymore. You are to take that old self, put it aside, and you are to be transformed from the inside out. You are to look more and more like God. Look more like God today than you did yesterday, more like him tomorrow than you do today. This is the call of discipleship in our life. Now, for many of us, if we've chosen to follow Jesus, we may have had areas of our life, parts of our hearts, that were transformed almost the moment we first put our faith in him. Like there's something new about us, and we feel that, and it's real. But there's other parts of us that God is going to slowly reveal to us and work with us through over the rest of the course of our life. It's what the church has called for thousands of years now, a process of sanctification, being made more and more like Christ and leaving behind the old self. This is what Paul is inviting us to do, to throw off the old self and to put on a new nature. Now, why is this so hard? Why is it difficult to actually change our day-to-day behavior? It's because that once something is ingrained, it's difficult to stop doing it. We almost go on autopilot. Like once we've really internalized something, we just start to habitually do that thing even without thinking. My dad told me a story when I was a kid. I don't know if it was a real story or a dad story. Probably a dad story, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway. So my dad says when he was 16 years old, his friend James got his driver's license, and James had been, taking the driver's test. It was a big deal. He just learned all the ropes of driving. And so they decided to take a little quick road trip just down the road about 15, 20 minutes to a town called Mineola, Texas, and then to come back to Grand Saline. And they came back late that night. The Grand Saline, Texas is where they lived. So my dad's in the passenger seat. James is driving. They have a friend of theirs in the back. And James, new driver, kind of wants to test out the muscle of the car. So he's going like 25 miles an hour over the speed limit, and they pass a police officer in between those two small towns. And as James is barreling down the road, he sees the lights flick on, and the police officer is going to pull him over. And James says to my dad, I cannot get a ticket. And my dad said, I'm pretty sure you're going to get a ticket. And James said, no, I really can't. Like, my dad will take this car away. He told me I cannot get a ticket. He will not let me drive anymore. But I was like, James, you got to pull over. And James said, I think I can get away from him. So it's late at night, it's dark, they're in the middle of nowhere, all these old country roads, there's no light, glow of the city at all. And so James turns off his headlights and takes a right onto a road. And the police officer sees him take that turn. So he looks in the rearview mirror, and the police officer is a ways back, but he turns down the right road. Well, James just keeps his headlights off, and he goes left, and then he goes right, and then he takes another right, and then he takes another left. He just keeps driving through these old roads, and every time he turns, the police officer is right behind him. And so at some point, he's freaking out, and he gives up, and he turns his headlights back on, and he pulls over to the side of the road. The officer comes up to them, and he is furious. So they have an extended conversation. James ends up explaining to him, my dad's getting my car away. I'm so nervous, first-time driver, all this kind of stuff. So the police officer softens a little bit, feels kind of bad for the guy, ends up definitely writing him a ticket anyway. But he should have gone to jail, so that's better. And so then James finally says, Officer, I got to know, my headlight's off. How did you know where I was turning every time? He said, son, you put your blinker on every time you went to take a turn. Which is a dead giveaway. So once behavior gets internalized, even when our future depends on stopping doing that thing, we tend to do it anyway. It's so difficult to stop doing bad behavior. And it's so hard to start doing good, positive behavior. It's really difficult. Why is it so hard? Lots of reasons. We looked at a few last week, but I wanted to look at one this week that I think is especially true. This is what James Clear calls the plateau of latent potential, right? Like, memorize that phrase, impress your friends at parties. It's a really great way to go, okay? The plateau of latent potential. In other words, you have potential inside of you, but you're going to plateau before you reach it. And when you start to plateau, you start to give up. You start to think like there's no sense in continuing to go forward and work hard at this thing. So I've got a graph I'm going to show you here. And I know some of you got up and you're like, can't wait to go to church. I hope there's a graph today. Well, you're welcome. All right, so we have results on this side and time on this side, right? If I put a lot of time into something, then I should see results. And in our minds, this should look fairly straightforward. Like let's take running, for example, okay? If I start running today, and I wasn't running before, then what I'm hoping is to see some immediate success, right? Like at the end of the first week, I may not be able to run a marathon, but I should probably be able to lose, 35 pounds. That'd be great. So I want to see some immediate wins, right? I want to see my body start to transform a little bit. I want to see myself being able to run a lot farther, like fairly quickly. And that would give me the perseverance to continue on because I would see the results. Unfortunately, this is not how adding a new habit works. The way it actually works is it takes a while to start seeing a return on the investment of a new habit. It looks more like this. Now, here's the good news. At some point, all that effort starts to have a compounding effect, and you start to see exponential results. But it takes a while for us to get anywhere close to where we think we should be. And continuing to do the same thing over and over while you can't really see the result is demoralizing. It's really hard to do it. James Clear calls this little gap here the valley of disappointment, right? Like, I thought it would look like this, but I can't hardly see any change at all. And so it's difficult to keep going forward with something good and new. It's really, really hard. I love this quote from Jacob Riis. When nothing seems to help, I go and look at a stonecutter hammering away at his rock, perhaps 100 times, without as much as a crack showing in it. Yet at the 101st blow, it will split in two. And I know it was not that last blow that did it, but all that had gone before. This is how changing our behavior often works. It takes a long time headed in the same direction to actually see a tangible result. But once you finally see it, you recognize it wouldn't have happened without all the work that went in before. But it's one reason it's so hard to change our behavior. It's one reason it's so hard to throw off the old self and to put on the new self. We have behaviors that are deeply ingrained in our brains. And we're going to look at how those get ingrained in just a few minutes. But that's one of the reasons it's so difficult. So we asked last week the question, who are you becoming? And this is the question that we had people talk about in small groups. This is a question we've been asking each other, even just in friend groups this week. Who are you becoming? Because it's hard to know what behaviors you should add or take away from until you answer this question, who are you becoming? Because when we think about goals, when we think about behaviors that we want to add, habits that we want to have, we really need to ask, how are they getting us closer to who we want to be or farther away from it? And if we don't start at this fundamental place, then any goal that we set is just going to feel arbitrary. And it's going to be easy to leave it behind shortly after we accomplish it. And this is the difference, by the way, between an identity goal and an objective goal. So James Clear says the ultimate form of intrinsic motivation is when a habit becomes part of your identity, right? It's not just what you do, it's who you are. It's one thing to say, I'm the type of person who wants this. It's something very different to say, I'm the type of person who is this, right? It's one thing to say that, and a lot of us have convinced ourselves, by the way, that we are somebody who we don't have to be. For instance, I would have told you, probably up until fairly recently, even just a few months ago, I'm not a morning person. Right? I would have said I'm not a morning person. Now, I have good reasons to say that. My dad was an evangelist growing up, and so oftentimes work was at night for him. And so even as a kid, like, he would come home 8, 9 o'clock at night, and he'd be there in the morning. He'd leave in the late afternoon. He'd come home 8 or 9 o'clock at night, and then he needed to wind down. So the party at the Crain household was just getting started. We'd watch movies together. We'd eat popcorn together. We'd eat midnight snacks together. Like, I did that my whole childhood into my teens growing up. I got into college. That wasn't better, I assure you. I didn't do a better job of getting to bed early in college. So my whole life, I've not been a morning person. The thing is, though, the world kind of operates on a schedule that is really beneficial if you're a morning person. And so if I just go through my whole life and say I'm not a morning person, what I'll do is I'll continue to stay up really late and then continue to have to get up early because that's when the world wakes up. And so I'll just keep not getting sleep day after day, month after month, year after year, and I'll never actually be alert enough to do what I could have done if I had just gotten more sleep. So I said for years that I'm not a morning person, only to realize that's a narrative that I've told myself, right? That's an identity I've grabbed onto that doesn't have to be true. Or you may have said before, like, well, I don't eat healthy. It's just not who I am. But it could be, right? These are all choices that we make. We choose like to eat healthy or not to eat healthy, or to wake up in the morning and get plenty of sleep the night before or not. These are choices we make. And so what really starts to happen is when we start to think of who we could be, to see it as an identity, like this is who we are, as opposed to what we're trying to do. I didn't set out to be a morning person. In fact, for most of my life, morning people have just driven me crazy. Like they've got so much energy and they're so happy at like 7 a.m., you know? Like not helpful to most of us, right? It's just not. So that may be you. You may be super chipper and that's great. But I didn't set out to be a morning person. I set out to be someone who was well rested. And what that ended up meaning is that I got up earlier, but I also went to bed earlier. So like it's got to be a part of who you are. So it's an identity versus an outcome goal. Just a few examples of this, right? The goal is not to pray 5 times a week. That's just an outcome. The goal is to become a person of prayer. That's an identity. Now you may have a short-term outcome, praying 5 times a week, that you are hoping stair-steps you to become a person of prayer. That's perfectly good. But what you really want to ask is, when I'm installing a habit, why am I installing it? Who is it that I am becoming? Another example, the goal is not to read a book, but to become a reader, right? Maybe you haven't read a book since high school or college, but you're just recognizing there's a world of information out there that I'm not plugged into, and so I want to start reading more. So you set a goal. I want to read 5 books this year, or 1 book this year, or 30 books this year. If you haven't read it all, too steep a goal. But whatever your goal is, right, that's a short-term goal. That's fine. But your goal is not to read 30 books this year. Your goal is to become a reader. The 30 books is just a stair step to get there. Or the goal is not to run a marathon, but to become a runner. How many of you here, if you're willing to just raise your hands, how many of you here have ever run a marathon or a half marathon? Can I see? Yeah, it's been about the same percentage, both all 3 hours. Low. All right, so yeah. So a few years ago, my friend and I decided to run a half marathon, right? I was about 30 years old at the time, and I thought it'd be a good thing. I ran long distance in high school. I'd really gotten out of practice, and I thought, okay, we'll run a half marathon. That'd be really fun. So we started working toward it, 5-6 months beforehand, to where by the time the half marathon got here, I was running 8, 10, 15 miles multiple times a week, and I had really changed essentially my body composition and how much sleep I was getting, all that kind of stuff. And the half marathon came, and we ran it, and we had good times for our lack of experience, all that, and I felt pretty good about it. And in fact, we felt so good about it that as soon as the marathon was over, we went and ate a really high-calorie steak together that night. It was just a really great way to celebrate running a marathon. Because I had not actually become a runner, I ran a half marathon, right? Was not a runner yet. So then we talked about, we should do this again next year. That'd be fun. That way we could be practicing year-round. And we thought, yeah, and there's a discount if you sign up on the day of. They got us, right? So we went online. We signed up for the next year for the same half marathon. Well, I got back home after that half marathon, and I thought, I have a whole year to train for the next one. I don't have to do it now. It'd be really nice to sleep a little bit later in the mornings and not run for a while. So I decided I was going to take a week off. That turned into 7 months. And then after 7 months, I thought I should probably start training again for this thing. And I started, but I got a little bit of an injury, which was demoralizing, so I stopped training. My friend just never started again. So finally, the half marathon comes around, and we've already paid for it. So we decided we'd just go run it. So we showed up, having not trained at all, and we got through mile 3 or 4, and I'm like, who needs to train for this? This is easy, no problem. Look at how well we're doing. About mile 8 and a half, we were dying. Parts of ligaments weren't working, joints were starting to this leg almost fell off. It was bad. We passed a Quickie Mart that was on the marathon route and had to stop to buy Gatorade because we could not make it to the next water station. That's the kind of shape we were in. The last couple of miles, I started getting passed, but I really think one of the gentlemen who passed me was probably about 90 years old. I had a form that looked like I was running, but you could have crawled past me if you wanted to, right? It was the appearance, but it was bad. And this 90-year-old runs past us. He tries to encourage us, and he's just like, keep your heads up, boys. It's a long race, And I was just like, that doesn't help, right? I hear you trying to encourage, but that does not help at all. So we finally got to the finish line. My wife's there at the end, right? And I was surprised anyone was still waiting for us, frankly, by then. And my wife is there, and she's got that look on her face like, I love you. You are so dumb. Just, you know. And so we finally got there. But here's the thing. I ran a half marathon, and I did whatever I did in that second half marathon. I did not become a runner. In fact, I only have one friend of mine who is actually a runner. I have a lot of friends who have run a marathon or a half marathon. It's a goal that someone set for themselves, and then they did it, and then they stopped. But it wasn't actually who they were becoming. It wasn't their identity. It was an outcome goal, not an identity goal. And the question for us is, who is God calling you to be? What does it look like for you to throw the old self on and put a new self, throw the old self off and put a new self on? Not for a season, not for a few months, not for a year even, but who is God actually calling you to be? We get so attached to our identities when God is always, like to follow Jesus is to always transform and to always change. James Clear says, habits can help you achieve all of these things, but fundamentally they are not about having something, they are about becoming someone. And this is the essence of it. Like whatever it is that you put in place this year, like it's about who you're becoming. And so just to recognize that that's what we're looking for, an identity, like a goal that hooks in with the identity that we feel God is calling us to. Now, how does this work? How do we start these habits up? And I just want to talk about the habit loop for a few minutes this morning as we start to kind of wind down, because I want us to understand how is it that we even get the habits that we have now, because then we can understand how to adopt new ones or to let some old ones go. Number one, it's just 4 steps here. There's a cue. There's some kind of cue. You hear something, see something, smell something that cues you up. Could be the smell of food. Could be that you see a guitar laying around and that makes you want to pick it up, like whatever it is. But there's a cue. Second, there's a craving. There's a desire. Whatever you saw, heard, smelled, whatever, gives you a craving for something. Then the third thing is a response. This is the actual action that you do. This is the habit. You have a response. You had a cue, there was a craving, you have a response, hopefully to satisfy the craving, and the fourth thing is the reward. The reward. And so your craving ends up being satisfied because it's rewarded. Like your response ends up being rewarded. Without the reward, the habit never actually forms. There's something inside of you that has to believe that there's a good outcome that's going to happen to this. Even if it's not an outcome, if you had a long time to think about it, you're looking for, at least in the moment, it's a good outcome. And so the reward is what reinforces the response to the craving and the cue. So all 4 of these are really important. So a few examples, because I think examples are helpful. Smartphone. Let's talk about smartphones for a second, right? All right, here's the cue. Your phone buzzes with a new text message. Now, if you're someone who checks your text messages often, and you have friends and loved ones and colleagues that you enjoy hearing from, over time, you have actually trained your brain to crave this little buzzing sound. And in fact, when you hear it, your brain, if you've trained yourself, probably releases a little bit of dopamine. It's just controls like your reward and pleasure centers. And you get excited about that little buzzing sound. So that's your cue, but then it leads to a craving. You want to learn the contents of the message. What are they saying? You know, are they thinking about me? Did they send me a funny cat picture? Like all this, there's all a world of possibilities. And so you have a response. You grab your phone and you read the text. And that leads to a reward. You satisfy your craving to read the message. Grabbing your phone becomes associated with your phone buzzing. This happens all the time. This is how that habit gets built, right? Cue, craving, response, reward. All right, another example, social media. Cue, you hit a stumbling block on a project at work. Could be that you're at your computer and you're like, oh goodness, I'm gonna have these 3 hard conversations to move forward. Or I'm gonna have to go research this whole big thing now. Or you're in a meeting and you're just bored out of your mind, like we just keep spinning this issue like around and around and around. So that leads you to a craving. You feel stuck and you wanna relieve your frustration, which leads you to a response. You open Instagram and you scroll through photos, which leads you to a reward. You satisfy your craving to feel relieved. Checking social media becomes associated with feeling stalled at work, right? This reinforces itself over and over and over again. And it may not be that it takes being stalled out at work for social media to become something that we habitually do. Have you ever just found yourself like scrolling Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or MySpace? I'm kidding, no one scrolls MySpace. And you find and you don't even remember pulling your phone out. You don't remember why you pulled it out. You don't remember why you started scrolling. It just kind of happened. You just found yourself doing it. It's because at some point you may have trained yourself. When I am bored for a microsecond, I need to pull this out. It's why when you go to Costco or you go to the grocery store, or you go to Albertsons, and you see people like in line, they're just in line for 30 seconds, right? Well, it depends on the store. Sometimes it's 8 hours, but mostly in line for 30 seconds, and what are they all? They're all on their phone, right? They've trained themselves that when I have a down moment, I need to be checking messages, checking social media, checking stocks, checking the news, right? Or I've noticed this every red light in Southern California that I've been at so far. I've noticed this. Light's red, right? It turns green. But the person at the front of the line had a second. So they thought, you know what, I probably have 12 seconds. I could probably read the entire LA Times if I tried real hard. And so they've got their phone up, right, leaning on the steering wheel, and they're just reading. Light's green, and they're not going yet. And that happens all the time. We've just trained ourselves, a lot of times without even thinking. Moment of boredom, phone up. All right? So it becomes a habit. And the reward is so quick, you're immediately like, oh, I was almost bored there for a second, but thank goodness Margie got a new cat. Oh, so much better, right? So you're so excited. So you just train, it's so easy to train yourself. Or one that I love, oh, this is so good, coffee. Coffee, right? So the cue, you wake up groggy because you didn't get enough sleep. Again. Craving, you want to feel alert. Response, you drink a cup, let's say, of coffee. Reward, you satisfy your craving to feel alert. Drinking coffee becomes associated with waking up. And if we're honest, most of us, when we started drinking coffee, most of us started drinking coffee because we wanted the caffeine. We wanted to wake up. I have known very few people in my life who had their first cup of coffee and went, that's delicious. Right? Like, because usually when you start, you're younger. You're a teenager, or you're young adults, and you've mostly trained your palate your entire life to drink water and probably sugary drinks, like apple juice or sodas or whatever. And so then you're not used to the flavor profile of a cup of coffee. You take that first sip of coffee, usually it looks like, you've got a fur ball in your mouth. Just trying to get through it, right? And then over time, you may learn that actually you do enjoy the flavor of coffee once you're used to it. But the starting point of you beginning to drink coffee was that you had something that you needed to fulfill, which was a craving to be more alert, more awake. Now, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't drink coffee. Lots of people enjoy coffee. But if you're the kind of person who, if you don't have caffeine first thing in the morning, you have a headache by 11, noon, it may be that you just don't want to have that need for it in order to avoid a headache. And so that may be that you decide that you don't want to drink as much coffee or drink coffee at all kinds of ways there. So here's what I want you to do this week. Again, I don't want you this week to pick a habit to keep doing or a habit to drop. This is all I want you to do. It's very, very simple. I want you to become an anthropologist of yourself. That's what I want you to do this week. Anthropology is just the study of human behavior. It's really easy to study other people's behavior. You ever sat in a shopping center and just looked around at people? It's fascinating, right? Study yourself this week. Study your own behavior. Notice when you start to habitually do something, right? Oh, look, my phone's up. I'm on Instagram. I can't even think about it. Or I got really angry at that person really fast. I wonder what's behind that. You're just asking the questions, right? What is it that cued what craving that I had this response, that I got what reward? Like that the things you're doing on autopilot, that's the reason you're doing it. There's something inside of you that feels like that's a good thing to do. So just become an anthropologist of yourself. Step back for a moment and ask, why did I have that reaction? Why did I choose to do that? And then for those of you who are in small groups, you're going to get in your small groups later this week and you'll talk about this. So what are some things that you noticed about yourself, And if it's something real personal, that's okay to keep it to yourself, but what can you share with some others? Some things that you've noticed that you like or that you don't like. These are habits that I'm glad I have. These are habits that I wish I didn't have, right? Those are great for conversation. I was talking with Greg Brown, our small groups pastor, with another pastor on staff a few weeks ago, and this was back early December when we were talking about this series, and the question was just this exact one. What are some things that you wish you could stop doing or start doing? And so we were just having a great conversation about that. And Greg said that most nights, and I got his permission to tell you this, by the way, most nights he falls asleep with his headphones on and a screen in front of him, like watching a show. And he said, I know that that's not healthy, that I don't get the best sleep like that, so I want to try to stop doing that. And I said, my habit, the one I really struggle with, is the snooze button. I love the snooze button. I would write it a Valentine's Day card if I could. Like, I love the snooze button. It's like, it's so wonderful because the alarm says I have to get up, and I'm like, no, I get up when I want to, right? 9 more minutes, I love the snooze button, and I love that Apple in Cupertino has dictated that I will sleep for exactly 9 more minutes and not a minute less, right? Like that's their decision. But snooze feels good. It's this little, I'm not supposed to do it. This is not even sleep. This is bonus sleep. It feels so good. But I've actually read a lot about sleep the last several years, and here's what I know. Snooze sleep does not help you at all. Like, it doesn't make you feel more rested. In fact, it makes you feel more groggy. It doesn't give you like a boost later in the day. It's too little of a sleep. You can't actually get back into a good sleep mind. It is just bad for you at every level. But it's really hard to believe that at 6 o'clock in the morning. So I just told them, I want to stop hitting the snooze button. I don't want to hit snooze anymore. If I set an alarm, that's the time I should get up. That would get my morning off to a better start, right? It's not about the snooze button. It's about like the kind of person I want to become. And I'd like to be more present with my family in the mornings. I'd like to spend more time in the scriptures in the mornings. I'd like to be able to, get places when I want to and just have a less frantic morning, basically. I think that would make the whole day go better. So we decided, several weeks ago, we're going to try to stop doing those things for the next few weeks and report to the congregation how it goes. And this morning I talked to Greg, and he said that things are actually going pretty well for him right now. He's not doing the screen anymore. He's keeping the headphones on, but we're going to call that a compromise. It was a good start. And I've only hit snooze twice in the last 2 or 3 times, I think, in the last several weeks, which is huge for me. Like, it's really, really big. But what did I have to do first? I had to become an anthropologist of myself. Why am I doing this? Why do I keep hitting snooze when I know it's not actually helpful? It's because I haven't really taken the time to focus on it before, and it's really hard to convince myself of what feels right in the morning unless I do. So you don't have to pick a habit. In fact, don't. We'll talk about that next week and the week after. Next week, we're going to look at how to start new good habits. The week after, how to stop bad habits. This week, all I want you to do, become an anthropologist of yourself. Recognize your behavior. Write about it. Write a few things down this week that you notice yourself doing, good or bad, that you just like to notice. You're just noticing it, and you're sharing it with a few people. Last couple things I just want you to leave with, just reminders. Who you are today does not determine who you are tomorrow. It doesn't. You like the person you are today? It doesn't mean you'll be this person a few years from now. You don't like something about the person you are today? It doesn't mean you have to be this person a few years from now. You're not held captive by this. Equally important, what you do today shapes who you will become tomorrow. All right? You want to be a person who is a person of prayer? Then what you do today will shape whether you are more like that tomorrow or less like that tomorrow. You want to be a person who's a better spouse or friend or coworker or family member? What you do today will shape whether tomorrow you are closer or farther away from being that person that you feel like God is calling you to be. What you do today shapes who you will become tomorrow. Because after all, truly God-honoring people do consistently what other people do occasionally. Notice your behavior this week. Come back next week, and we'll talk about what it looks like to begin to add some things to become more and more like the person that God is calling us to be. Father, thank you for our time together today. Lord, thank you that you're not done with us yet. Thank you, God, that you love us so much, that you love us exactly how we are, but that you love us too much to leave us there. And I thank you that Jesus called us to keep transforming, and that Paul commanded us to throw off the old self and to walk into a new reality that's based and grounded in Christ. And Lord, we just pray that we're people who are more like Jesus tomorrow than we are today, and more like him today than we were yesterday. Would you please give us the strength not to fall overly in love with whatever identity is that we have today, but to recognize that you are constantly calling us to transformation and to newness. And Lord, would you give us this week the mindfulness to observe ourselves and the things that we're doing so that we may consider what to shift and change as this year continues so that we could look more like you. It's in Jesus' name we ask these things. Amen.